Welcome to D&G 144. This is Draw Night of the Creators Series show here at Take on the World TV as we continue our discussions on Avram.
Yeah, wait, he's alive. He's alive. Yeah, wait, look. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Yeah, wait.
Okay, it's been a little bit. I got a few people in the chat. Oh, how's your unleavened bread going for those of you who are observing? I know the timings and the calendars and things all differ, so some of you might already be done. And I think there might be one or two calendars out there that hasn't done Pesach yet, but most all have started Pesach within the past week and a half, right? Okay, so this is a video I actually felt I was supposed to do like 3 video turns ago. For those of you who've been paying attention, usually I do Saturdays and Wednesdays, and the past couple I haven't for all kinds of reasons and excuses of mine. And then tonight we are foregoing the Days of Noah video. Jeff's spending some time with his family for the feast and things like that, so yeah, willing, we're going to be picking that up next week, I believe is the timing for that. So I thought we would continue our Avram studies. Let's see if there's anything in the chat here. Purging out the leaven. For anybody who hadn't caught it, we actually did a D&G 144 written short post about what it means to purge out the leaven, trying to give some basic, fundamental, foundational understanding, especially for those who are new to keeping feasts and things of that nature. I see it can be overwhelming for a lot of people when they first come in. There's all these different views, and you have the way the Orthodox are doing it, and then you have some of the TO or TP, however you want to call it, Torah observant, Torah pursuant circles. It can be a bit much looking into what is considered leavening, what is considered leavening agent, and things like that. And at the end of the day, it seems to me that the scriptural emphasis, it's a physical instruction, but the emphasis is on the spiritual. So let's not let that get away from us when we're keeping these feasts. Yes, we do the physical things, but we're remembering and thinking about what they signify, because it is the spiritual leaven and the purging out of the leavening spiritually that is more important. So when you look at scripture, a lot of people say leaven refers to sin, and they talk about all the verses that talks about it being puffed up, and they point to verses about pride, often use verses in Proverbs. And I'm not negating that, but when we're looking at leaven for unleavened bread feast, I mean, the word leaven is actually a neutral term in scripture. This can be a positive or negative depending on the context. Whereas sin, that's never positive, right? So when we look at Yeshua, he tells his disciples to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And then there's certain verses, I think it was in Luke, that specify that it's talking about the hypocritical nature of their doctrine. So that's the things that I tend to think about when you find that you found leavening in your cupboards that you thought you got out in the middle of the week, right? And you're bummed about it. Instead of getting all mad at yourself, I mean, you did what you could, right? You tried to look for it, you swept up, you cleaned the house, you try to get the leavening out beforehand, and then you find that one box of pancake mix you forgot about. You find, there's certain chips that you had hidden in your little snack drawer in the nightstand or whatever, and you didn't realize they had leavening in them, whatever it is. Instead of getting so hung up on the physical, think about the spiritual implications there in the nature of maybe there's some hypocritical nature in myself that I need to consider that I forgot about, that was hidden. When I went to cleanse out things, that was something I forgot about. So rather than getting hung up on the pancake mix as you find it and then go throw it away, perhaps go in prayer about what is the hidden pancake mix in your doctrine, in your beliefs, your understanding. You got to remember, doctrine is not just about what you believe, but rather what you do with those beliefs, the actions that come forth from it. That's what makes it either hypocritical or not. So it's not just a matter of, is the pre-tribulation rapture true or false, and making sure you have the right doctrine in that sense, but in a matter of, are you following the ways of Yeshua, through actions, not just by words, for it's the doer, not just the hearer of the Torah, right? Okay, anyways, that's not what about tonight is about, although I do welcome questions about Pesach and unleavened bread, with the understanding that since I'm not prepared for that, that I might not be as well notated as I normally would be had I prepared tonight's video for that topic. But if you have questions or concerns, and if I see it in the chat, right, sometimes I don't see them, I will try to acknowledge and go over if there's questions and concerns. Okay, so Genesis 12, and I think where we left off was verse 4, right? And we talked a lot about in the first Avram video, we talked a lot about numbers and things, and we're going to be going into that a little bit tonight too, a little bit further in depth, a little bit more speculation, rather than last video I felt was less speculation, but rather proving all the verses in Acts 7 and Stephen's speech, along with Genesis 11, 31 to 12 verse 4, as well as Hebrews, 8 something, how they all seem to contradict and how in reality they do not. But that was more factual. Tonight I have some number things on some speculation. Okay, so let's see what I got for my notes. Let's just go to chapter 12 first. How about that? And then I'll go over my notes after. It'll probably be a shorter video tonight. Okay, so verse 4. So Avram departed as Yahovah had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Avram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran, right? Out of Haran. The city, the town that we believe was probably named after his deceased brother. And Avram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, Haran's son, and all their substance that they had gathered. Okay, right there. They're already not empty-handed. Okay. And the souls that they had gotten in Haran. So now they have servants and workers and hirelings and things of this nature. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan. And into the land of Canaan they came. And Avram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. And Yahovah appeared unto Avram, which I'm thinking means Yeshua. And said, unto thy seed I will give this land. And there he builded an altar unto Yahovah, who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto Yahovah, and called upon the name of Yahovah. And Avram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Okay. And there was a famine in the land, and Avram went down into Mitzrayim, into Egypt, to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save you alive. Say, I pray thee, that thou art my sister, that it may be well for my sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. And it came to pass that when Avram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her, and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he entreated Avram well for her sake. And he had sheep and oxen, donkeys, men servants, maid servants, male and female donkeys, and camels. And Yahovah plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Avram and said, What is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was your wife? Why sayest thou, She is my sister, so I might have taken her to me to wife? Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife and all that he had. Okay, let's go back up. All right, let's see what I have for my notes. Let's go up. I don't have too much for notes. Okay, looking at the first 3 verses of 12, we see that this is not conditioned. Okay, so that's worth pointing out. I'm not going to go too much into the covenant tonight. That's a whole nother video all on its own. But I do think it's worth pointing out that the first 3 verses here in chapter 12 show that it is not conditioned. Nowhere in those first 3 verses can we say that Yah tells Avram, if you do these things, then I will. Right? When you read him, it says, Now Yahovah said to Avram, Get you out of your country, from your kindred, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. And in thee all families of earth shall be blessed. There is no do this, and therefore, and then I will. This is not conditional. This Abrahamic covenant is non-conditional, which you actually later on see when it comes to making the covenant, when they have the splitting of the animals and the walking through the blood. Avram's actually having a vision while Yah does it. It was a one-way testifying of that covenant. Yah saying he was testifying by himself. Usually you would have both parties walk through in agreement. So he was swearing it upon himself, saying, I will do this. But again, that's for maybe a whole nother video. I don't know if I'll ever do a video on that or not, but if we do, we'll go into more depth on what I'm talking about there if you're not familiar. Okay, so, okay, yeah, it's not conditional. Now we see in verse 4 here, Avram is 75, right? Now we talked about that some in the last video, but we're going to go on that a little bit more in more depth, but like I said, with a little bit more speculation here. Okay, so Avram is leaving Haran at 75, right? And we discussed why that looked like an error and how it's not actually an error. And interestingly enough, this past week and the week prior, and probably the week before that, when I was looking at it, comparing the Masoretic to the Septuagint to see some discrepancies, because there are discrepancies in other sections, like Genesis 10 with the genealogy and the age dropping 100 years, which I think I mentioned in the last Avram video. Interestingly enough, the Septuagint and Masoretic both agree here on Avram being 75. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, so you have in verse 5 there, all their substance they had gathered, and the souls they had gotten in Haran. Okay. Now, we don't know how long they were in Haran. I'm going to get back to that verse 5 here in a minute. When we get into chapter 13 here, I have some things I want to connect with that verse there. So just highlight or make a note, make an asterisk, what have you, underline it, or just make a mental note. Okay, just checking the chat to see. Okay, moving forward. Okay, we don't know how long they were in Haran. I actually spent something like 2 days doing this study, trying to figure out how much time they were in Haran, because I like doing things like that, just to see if I could come up with a bracket of time. If I couldn't get, within a couple of years, I wanted to see how close I could narrow it down. So this is the best I could do. Okay, so the best that I came up with was at least 15 years. It seems to me more so, but I'm gonna say it's gonna be at least 15 years in Haran, and up to max being somewhere around 40-ish years. And I'm thinking it's less than 40. So somewhere, personally, I'm thinking closer to 25 to 40, but I'm going to go lenient and go 15 to 40. So I'm going to explain here why I say that. Okay. We know that Terah died at the age of 205. That's Genesis 11, verse 32. And that Terah would have left past the age of 70, because this is where we see at age of 70 for Terah is when he had started having children, right? Which we discussed in the last video. Probably wasn't when he had actually Avram, but more than likely Nahor or Haran, whichever was his firstborn. I'm guessing Haran, but I really don't know. But that's Genesis 11:26. He said 70. So we can already subtract that from the 205 from when they left Haran, because it says that he left Haran after his dad died, right? And that doesn't say that here in Genesis. It says that elsewhere, I think in Acts 7. Okay, so his son Haran died in before adult Avram. Now I'm saying Avram has to be an adult here because he's already married to Sarai, which we see in Genesis 11:31. And he's taking Terah's grandson, Lot, Avram's nephew, to Haran with him. Okay, so now we can add to those 70 years. We know it's less than 135 because Avram had to be old enough to have a wife. Now we could speculate on how young he could have married. But we're also, keep in mind, told that Sarai was barren in Genesis 11, verse 30. And this is before moving to Haran. Now, that doesn't necessarily indicate that she was an elder at this point, but to call a young woman barren, I mean, it can, but how young? I mean, you have to have known that you've gone past a certain point. So she couldn't have been under a preteen age. You see what I'm saying? So, because some people might speculate that they were really, really young, which is silly in my opinion. Okay, so now we're looking at more than likely less than 100 years, right? Because of the 135. So that would put at 100 years, that would put, let's see, I think I was suggesting that Avram was 60 years in, so that lines up with the 205 with him being 75, which would be 130, right? So now you're having 75 years, right? Okay. Now, if Avram was born 60 years after Haran or Nahor, which is what I suggested in the last video, we could cut that time in less than half of 100 in order for him to be old enough to be about 30, 35 to be leaving for Haran, which cuts it down to somewhere around 40 years. Now, based on Genesis 14:14, if you go to Genesis 14:14, in Genesis 14, that's where Lot gets kidnapped when you have the 9-king army. In verse 14 there, it says that Avram took 318 men with him that were born in his household. Now, see up here in verse 5, it says that they took everything that they had acquired with them, including substance and people with them from Haran. So in order to have this battle, we know that they spent less than 10 years in Canaan, because 10 years into Canaan is when he has Ishmael. So this is before that point. So because of that, looking at these 318 men, assuming that they had to be at least the age of 20, 25, you're looking at somewhere between 15 to 40 years on Haran. Does that really matter? No, not really. Is it speculative? A little bit. But I thought it was interesting and I wanted to have fun with it. So there's in a nutshell, summed up my view on how long they were in Haran. So if it had been closer to 40 years, that means Avram would have been something like 35, leaving Ur to go to Haran, leaving Haran at 75 after being there for 40 years. I'm thinking it's a little bit less than 40. Okay. Next stop is Shechem. I didn't really want to get into it tonight too much with the journeys of Avram. As I suggested in the last video, I looked into it more, Karen, if you're curious, and I'm still not ready to do a video on just that. I don't know if I ever will, but if I do, I'll probably keep it real nice and short and actually stick to just the journey of where is Ur, where is Haran, because there are differing views on that, which is not surprising, right? The more you look into these type of studies, there's always issues of where and when, and when it says Ur of Chaldees, I mean, the typically commonly accepted one now is a Sumerian. So you're talking down in Iraq, okay, the southern part of what would have been the Ur Empire. But interestingly enough, the more I look into it, the more it seems to be pointing to the northern border of Syria into the southern border of Turkey, which would make a lot of sense if that's the case, because then you have a direct line straight south. Notice here in Genesis 12, it says that they're heading south. Okay, now you can use that verse with both. You could say they went up to Haran and then came down south, right? So that in of itself doesn't prove anything. But the more I look at it, up until about the 1800s, interestingly enough, the understanding was that it was in Turkey. It wasn't until Dr. Woolley came through with his archaeological findings, which he was known to have a flair with the audience and to be real convincing and persuasive with his wording, which does not mean that we should necessarily trust him. It seems to me that he had these findings that seem to point to Sumer being the location of the Ur of the Chaldees during the time of Avram, when he would have been there. Because that's the whole point. It's not a matter of where was Ur, it's a matter of where is Ur of Chaldees during the time of Avram, okay? Because a lot of the documentation and a lot of the archaeological information that we try to find in terms of Ur of Chaldees, we don't actually see it being called of Ur of Chaldees really anywhere until after the time of Avram. So it becomes this whole issue. It's funny how we got a question about the miles. That's actually one of the more minute reasons, not a strong peg in, but I find it interesting because with Turkey, you're looking at a couple months travel to go from Haran to Canaan. Whereas if it's in Sumer, which would have been you would have an easily direct east to west line that you could have taken instead of going all the way up into Haran in Turkey and then coming down south. You're looking at adding 4 or 5 months to the travel. I think it was something like 150 versus 250. I mean, you're looking at almost half. I mean, you're talking months of travel. My mom's turning 70 in a couple of years. We got somebody in the chat talking about her mom turning 70 and comparing it to Sarah. That's actually something I wanted to get into a little bit tonight. I won't spend too much time on it. But anyways, simply put, I'm not ready to really go through all of the information because I'm still trying to get my notes together, and I'm still trying to make sure I'm sitting at Turkey. Being Armenian and Assyrian, I find it very funny that I keep coming to Turkey as the answer for many things, because especially as an Armenian, the last thing you want to do is highlight Turkey. But anyways, that's where I'm sitting at, is a Turkey location, both for Haran and for the Ur of Chaldees, where Avram would have come out of. But that's for a whole nother video down the road, maybe. So if we do that, then we'll go into Shechem and the travels into the Plain of Moreh, and we'll talk about that mountain with the lesser side on the side, how that fits the script here. When it's talking about the in verse 8 here, talking about the mountain on the east of Bethel and how there's a lower side of the mountain, all those things, those all tie in really well and really seem to point to Turkey, in my opinion. So that's a whole thing for that. So we'll just kind of skip past that for now, and we're going to stop at verse 10 here. So I find this interesting, right? I was actually thinking about titling tonight's video, "The Throne of Satan Was in Turkey." Yeah, that's one of the things that's often discussed as well, talking about Pergamum, right? The throne of Satan, reference there at in Revelation. That's a whole nother topic as well. Yeah. Okay. So anyhow, yeah. So I was actually thinking about titling tonight's video something along the lines of cycles or patterns or foreshadowing or circles. Because especially this past week, going back over my notes, since I didn't do this particular tonight's video a week and a half ago, like I felt like I was supposed to, which the more I look at it this week, I realize why it would have been good to do it before Pesach, for a lot of people to see how Avram ties into Pesach in ways that I don't tend to see mentioned very often. I mean, most people will point to Avram and Isaac, referencing to Yeshua, right? You have the Father and the Son and things like that. And that's normally tied in, but there's some things here before that point here in chapter 12 that I would argue also point to the Exodus account for the original Pesach. Okay, so we look at verse 10 here. There was a famine in the land, and Avram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. And I just thought that was kind of interesting, because now it's reminiscent of Joseph, right? And Jacob, Joseph, all of Israel. I find that interesting. It was a famine that caused them to go down there to see that Joseph was already in Egypt, but Joseph got sent into the kidnapping by the hand of Yah. He allowed it so that the family would be saved and become a nation hundreds of years later, all circled around this famine that caused them to go to Egypt. And here we have the same thing with Avram. There's a famine, and so he goes down to Egypt. Now, we had speculated in the last video that perhaps because of Avram's I don't want to say refusal. I want to say hesitancy to fully, completely obey all the instructions right away, right? Which we talked about in the last video. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and check the first video. It's just called Avram. It's got a nice little tent design there that my wife made, and it's got Avram going up diagonally. Altar at Shechem and everything that happens thereafter is super interesting. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff there. For sure, Karen, for sure. You probably have all kinds of notes in there to say that you know, I didn't even notice, kind of thing, or you'd be able to go into more depth than I can. But so it's a famine that leads them there to Egypt, right? And it's interesting because, you know, Moshe was connected to Egypt, Avram was connected to Egypt, Isaac's connected to Egypt. He has some connections there. So does Jacob, obviously, Yaakov, Israel, right? You see, I mean, Yeshua himself has connections to Egypt. You know, when the Herod the Great wanted to have him killed, right? Not Herod Antipas, but Herod the Great wanted all the baby Hebrew boys under the age of like 2 or 3 to be slaughtered. They fled to Egypt. So it's just kind of neat, right? And so they get to, as they're getting near to Egypt, right? So notice it says, and it came to pass, right? Some time has come, they're on their travels, when he was come near to enter into Mitzrayim. So he's getting close enough to be able to see it maybe from the distance. And the fear starts to creep in, the doubt starts to creep in, right? Which might have been part of the reason we could argue speculatively that that's why he's even going towards Egypt to begin with, because we don't see actual instruction to go into Egypt. I'm not saying it's disobedient that he's going into there, but we don't see Yah instructing him to go to Egypt, right? Something to consider. As he's coming near to Egypt, he says to Sarai, it's not Sarai yet, right? Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a fair woman to look upon, right? Apparently she was very attractive. She was pretty. And you have that word fair there, which, you know, you have pretty, but you can also indicate maybe some lighter skin tone, lighter features. And it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see you, that they'll say, this is his wife, let's kill him, right? But they'll save her alive. So he begs her, he asks her to say that she is his sister in order for his life to be saved, which, you know, there's all kinds of sermons out there about how this was like, you know, the most embarrassing moment of Avram's life, that he begs his wife to say that she's the sister. Now, interestingly enough, it's not really fully deceptive because they were half siblings. I'm not going to go into all the verses that show that, and then the arguments on whether or not Terah had multiple wives simultaneously, or if his first wife died and then he had another wife. But Scripture does show us that Avram and Sarai were half siblings. Could this be an example of being wise as serpents? It depends on your view here. You know, it really depends on your view. It's kind of like a lot of people talk about Yaakov. They talk about Jacob being deceptive, and I saw him as being wise as serpents in a lot of his dealings with Laban. I didn't see it as so much deceptive and tricky and tricksy and slimy as I did see him as trying to get the best out of his hand that he could. So that depends on your view on this, but I do see some notation of fear and doubt, which makes me think more along the lines of cowardly rather than wise as serpents. But you could, I suppose, look at it that way, Mitzi. Oh, I know. I love the soundtrack for Prince of Egypt as well. Matthew Jensen, who I love I love that guy and the stuff he, you know, I don't agree with him on all of his doctrine. We disagree on some things about the Messiah and stuff like that, but overall his stuff tends to be really solid. And if you have him on Facebook, he had a video of him and his daughter, I'm guessing, singing the songs from Prince of Egypt, and man, they impressed me. I mean, their music skills and the vocal range and the skills and the control of those tones was way better than what I would have expected. So that was really pleasant to listen into. Okay, so anyways, moving forward. Okay, so he's coming near to Egypt. And that's when he looks to her and says, you know, say that you're my sister. And we actually see this again later on. Jasher even claims that this happens multiple times, not just what Genesis tells us, because we see this again later. And we'll talk about that in another video later. But we see this not just with Avram, we also see this with Isaac, right? So he says, you know, when they see you and they you know, you're pretty. Okay, so here's some things to think about, right? There's a few things we need to consider here. Biblically speaking, at this time, we're not looking at the age range of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? Yes, Isaac did do the same. Yeah, that's for a whole nother video. But yeah, I will allude to that. I see it as being an issue of fear of men. Yeah, I agree with you on this one, Karen. That's kind of what I see too. I'm not pointing fingers at Avram. I'm not bashing Avram. He's human, you know, and it's kind of neat. I don't want to say that in a positive way, but it's kind of neat to see some of the flaws so that when we think of these great, father figures of the faith, when we look at Avram, Isaac, Jacob, Moshe, Noah, you know, we tend to put them on this pedestal of great godly men, and they were, but they're not Yeshua. They're not perfect. So they did have moments of fear and doubt. They had cowardly moments. They had sinful moments. They had moments where they gave into temptations and things of that nature, right? Okay, so a few things to consider. First off, even though we're not during the time of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, you do see the life expectancy to be longer at this time period. Yes, Abimelech. And then there's the whole argument of which Abimelech. There's multiple Abimelechs, right? And then, you know, it's the whole matter of, is it the same Abimelech? But it's not. There's no way, because you're talking a long period of time. So I disagree on not being the same. And then you have the argument of, is Abimelech a name or is it a title, like Pharaoh or king? Kind of like what we talked about in the Esther studies with the Ahasuerus and stuff like that. Okay, so I'm going to say first point to consider. We know that Sarah's older, right? We see Avram is 75, past 75 at this point. He's left Haran, so he's past the age of 75, right? At least 75, 76, somewhere in there. If not possibly a little bit older, but I think based on the in-depth studies that I'm not going to go into all the notes on that tonight, it seemed that, this was shortly after leaving Haran. That he went down and then just kept going, went straight into Egypt. He saw the famine in the land and just kept moving forward. So if we consider Sarah being pretty as an older, like with Yaakov in Egypt, which is later on, we see him at the age of like 120 and 130. And that's when it starts talking about his eyes going dim and things of that nature. Nowadays, if somebody reaches the age of 120, eyes going dim is not how you would describe the maturity of the degradation of their flesh, right? It'd be like, well, they're not really getting out of bed anymore, kind of thing, not that their eyes are going dim. So it seems to me what I'm getting at here is that when it's talking about Sarah being 70, 80, 90, and then she's like, in her 90s when it's talking about giving birth and things of that nature, instead of thinking of today's 90, you cut it down a good 20, 30 years. And I say that because it seems like, whether it's because of the lack of GMO, the lack of all the chemicals, all the pesticides, all the chemtrails of today, all the pollution, every which way you can think of in terms of water and air and food and, even noise pollution and electrical pollution. And they had advanced technology back then, but I think things were a lot more pure. So it seems that the body was able to last a lot longer, which makes me think the aging rate was slower. So when we're thinking 90 biblically at this time period, I think it'd be more fit to say 55, 60 of today. Does that make sense? So you can have a woman of that age where we can say, okay, yeah, she's older, but there is the possibility of her still being fair to look at, right? Which we're not going to typically say about 80s and 90s and above. You might be impressed that they're still kicking and they're running around and, they got some skip to their step, some flair to their step, some punk to them left, but you're not going to typically describe them as being fair to look upon, right? So that's the first thing to think about. Second thing to think about, because this is not the first part of Avram's travels, we don't see Avram having this fear and doubt in and we don't see Avram having this fear and doubt and issue in Haran. So what is it about Egypt? Are they known for a sexual immorality that abounds and proceeds and goes beyond their boundaries to the point where, the rumors and the stories and, well, those Egyptians, is it one of those types of situations? We also have to consider in terms of fair, right? And I don't want to get into this too much tonight, but there is sociological and psychological studies on what they call, coloration theory in terms of beauty, right? Like you'll have the Black community, the African American community, how if you ask them, if you know them, if you're amongst that community, there's often at least jokes about how the lighter skinned are considered to be the more attractive by more than not, right? It depends on your taste. And my point being, when it says that she's fair here, perhaps she had lighter tones to her than the Egyptians. And that would also be part of what they would consider extra beautiful, right? At the very least, we have exotic, right? And we can see that in all cultures. We can see that in all nations around the world. When somebody is from a different land, they're considered exotic. If you're looking for, when you're young and you're single in your 20s and you're sexually immoral and stuff like that, you might be looking for somebody who's exotic, someone that differs. It's just like any kind of other greed that comes with abundance, whether it's about money or food, what have you. There's no true satisfaction in the abundance, so you're constantly looking for more, right? Well, it would be with this case as well. Jubilee says Rivka was, I don't trust Jubilees though, Karen. I don't trust Jubilees, especially when it comes to numbers and things. I've seen a lot of discretions and stuff. In fact, I wanted to use Jasher for tonight's video and study, and you can ask my wife and my mother-in-law. I spent a good few hours studying out Jasher on Avram, trying to see what Jasher says, looking at chapter 8 and 9. Let's see if I have any other notes. Yeah, and the only thing I could find in Jasher concerning Avram during what we're discussing tonight in the video from before is in Jasher 8 verse 28. It says Avram was the youngest, which I found interesting because that fit. Yeah, I don't trust Jasher either, Karen. I mean, I like it for certain things, but what I was getting at for tonight, Jasher doesn't even agree with itself. I have all these notes about how it claims that Avram was born when Haran was 32, and that Haran got married at 39 and had his first son. And then when Avram was 10 and Haran was 42, that's when Sarai was born. And then Avram was 50 and Haran was 82. That's when he died. But then it's got this whole fanciful story about how it's in the furnace, right? And it seems to mirror the book of Daniel in ways that seems like they really wanted it to. But later on, you find that the aging of Avram is inconsistent inside of its own account in Jasher. You've got Jasher saying that Avram moved to Haran at 52, being told to move to Canaan at 55, leaving at 55, but also leaving at 52, but also leaving at 58. Jasher doesn't know what Jasher's story is. So, I don't trust that Enoch 1, Jasher, or Jubilees of today are the more trustworthy, inerrant, possibly ones that we would have had that the scriptures refer to when they talk about, is it not written in Jasher? I think they have been meddled with, and perhaps that's why we don't see them in the canonized today. And I know a lot of people aren't going to like that I said that, but it is what it is. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that Sarai was not just pretty, but that the aging was slower process. So when you're thinking of Sarah being older, we're looking more at 45 to 62 type of aging of today, rather than 70, 80, 90. I'm going to suggest that she was lighter toned, and perhaps there's an appeal there for the Egyptians at least. I'm going to suggest that the Egyptians were known for sexual immorality at that time, because that's what the documentation and records seem to point to. And I'm also going to suggest that Sarai, being not native of Egypt, but rather, whereas with Ur and Haran, which was still part of the empire of Ur, would not have been considered exotic, but would be for Egypt. So I think these are all things to consider when you see Avram's concern here, that it was very legit. And sure enough, when they came into Egypt, what does it say? It says the Egyptians beheld that the woman was very fair. She was pretty. And the princes of the Pharaoh saw her, and they took her to the Pharaoh. Now, if you compare verse 15 here, 12 verse 15 to Egyptian documentation, which tends to leave out the negative things, right? But I would compare this to, yeah, I understand what you're saying there, Karen. It's varying depending on the culture of terms of fair and things like that, because I know what you're talking about. I've seen that as well with the Caucasians when their skin is super white and it's not actually favored upon usually in our culture for the past so many decades. So I know what you're talking about there. But anyways, yeah, we're seeing that in the Mexican community as well. Yeah, you're going to see that depending on the cultures and things like that. And at the end of the day, beauty is beauty, right? It's in the eye of the beholder. I'm not claiming myself that any certain type is prettier than others. I'm just saying, culturally speaking, for the masses, perhaps for the Egyptians, fair tones, lighter tones would have been considered more beautiful by their community standards at that time. Okay, so but we see that Avram's concern here was legit, because they come in and what happens? They take her to the Pharaoh's house. Now, I'm of the personal opinion, based on not just what I feel in the spirit, but also looking at the Egyptian documentation here, that Pharaoh wouldn't have actually touched Avram's wife at this point. that Sarai would not have been touched yet. Now, Jasher has an interesting account on this, right? And interestingly enough, we do see in verse 17 here, it says, Yahovah plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Avram's wife. Now, did the modern day manuscript of Yasher take that verse and then contrive a story from that? I don't know. Or is it from more of the original Yasher and can be more trusted? I'm not sure, but it has some interesting things in there about how an angel of Yah stopped his hand from touching her, and he felt struck down. And by what was it, the third time, he was like, all right, what's going on with this? And then he had dreams and things like that. Whatever the case was, we do see that Yah intervenes. Great plagues because of Sarai, Avram's wife. So as to say, we don't see scripture outright indicating that there was consummation here. We don't actually have scripture outright saying that she slept in his bed with him. We see that she was taken into the house. Well, you know, as I argued in Esther, and when you look back at the documentation, most scholars would agree that when it says Pharaoh's house here, it's not actually referring to his specific rooming, but rather there was multiple houses, and that it refers to the royal house courts, which involved many houses. And you had the house that you would come into, and then after a purification ritualistic situation, which often would take a lot of time, as we see with the Persians with the book of Esther, then afterwards, if they became a concubine, they'd be moved into the concubine housing and things of that nature, right? So I just thought that was worth mentioning here. Verse 16, I'm going to argue, was dowry. For some of you, maybe that's new. It seems to me this is an engagement process, okay? So the Pharaoh brings in Sarai, recognizing Avram as the brother and not as the husband, seeing him as the closest kin, entreats Avram and gives him sheep, oxen, donkeys, men servants, maid servants, she donkeys, camels, right? This is a dowry. This is an engagement. Now, I'm going to argue that he left with that dowry. Okay, so Yah plagues Pharaoh and his house. And then it comes to a point, however Yah does it, whether it's through visions or dreams or an angel or a combination, however it happens, Pharaoh seems to understand that it's because she's the wife. Now, I can't remember if Jasher claims this about Avram or about Isaac, that he looked out the window and saw that they were playing, and the term they were playing seemed to mean to flirt, that they were sportly flirting, not inappropriately, but as you would with a spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend, not with just a stranger. It showed that there has been intimacy in the past there, but I think that might have been about Isaac, not Avram. I can't remember. I don't put too much stock into Jasher, so I didn't make notes on this here. But either way, we see Pharaoh recognizes that she's the wife. And he says, why'd you say she's your sister, that I might have taken her to me to wife? Again, I would argue that this seems to indicate the quite strong possibility. It doesn't outright say, you could argue it either way, but it seems to me in canon, is it Isaac and Rivka? They were chasing each other, possibly foreplay. I don't know if I'd call that foreplay, but more so of when I did that study, and keep in mind it was years ago, it was based on the words of sporting, mocking, playing, and things like this nature, and it seemed to mention flirting, kind of like, poking and then running around, poking and running around. I wouldn't consider that foreplay so much as, playfully in a good mood, but that's me personally, right? Thus thinketh Ian. That's how it's coming across to me. Yeah, that's true as well. Right. They were not acting as brother and sister. Right. That's for sure. Yeah, we can definitely say that. Okay. Might have taken her to me to wife, which seems to me to possibly indicate all the more the strong possibility that he hadn't actually touched her yet, that she was still in the purification process of the engagement. He said, now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. See the urgency there? And then it says, and furthermore, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away. Guards, It's just like when you get kicked, when somebody would get kicked out of a club or something like that, and they have the security escort them out, and somebody's getting fired and they need to leave, even if they're not acting atrocious, you want your backup there. It commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife and all that he had. Okay, so we have verse 20 there, all that he had. We have verse 16 there, which I'm going to argue is the dowry, which has been a multiplication of his cattle and his hirelings, right? We have sheep and oxen and donkeys and camels and men and women servants, okay? And then you have back in verse 5 that they already had substance and souls that came with them out of Haran, okay? So keep this all in mind. Now, before we move forward into 13, so I can point this even more on how we see that Avram is really wealthy at this point. Yeah, but Karen, that word can mean multiple things. And I would argue that it's not the same. It's the same term, but kind of like how we can do this with the English language. We can use a word and give many different meanings based on the context. Seems to me that that word playing, mocking, as it is actually in the scripture when it go to with Ishmael and Isaac, actually reference to more of a making fun of, but even seem to point to more towards a sarcastic, but not so sarcastic, like threatening, which I find very interesting. And that's for a whole nother thing, but I go into that with the Genesis 4, and to keep it short, Jasher suggests that Ishmael had a bow to mock, to play, right, to laugh, which would fit for the situation with Abimelech, but to jest and to mock. And when you look at mock and you look at other usages of that type of context, it gives more credence to the claim in Jasher of the pulling a bow and arrow, at least suggesting I would kill you, which I would say we even see hinted at and given a nod to in scripture later when Hagar is sent away. She goes a bow shot away from Ishmael, which is the only time we see this in scripture. Every other time distance equated to that type of measurement would be considered a stone's throw, not an arrow shot away. And then shortly after that, after the messenger of Yah tells Hagar, go back, I'm going to make Ishmael a, there's going to be many nations, there's going to be a strong nation underneath him. He's going to have, 12 princes and things like that. Shortly after that, like not even very many verses afterwards, it says that he became a great archer. And interestingly enough, Genesis backs up the account of Jasher as well, of Esau and Ishmael both being taken to the bow and hunting and becoming friendly and being close together. So I would suggest, even though it's the same term, I would disagree in the use of that term in those two different contexts. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is what I wanted to get into tonight. And this is why I was saying that probably why I felt urged to do this specific video about Avram a week and a half ago. And I did not obey on that. I can't remember all my reasons on that, but there was a Wednesday and then a Saturday and then this last Wednesday again. And this last Wednesday again, I just was not in the right mind space and things like that. And I felt like I was not as prepared as I'd like to be and stuff like that. Correct. Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Same term, different usage. Yes, and that's what I'm trying to get at here. Okay, so let's look at Exodus 12 compared to Genesis 12, because this was the first time that I really compared the two. Usually when I'm comparing Exodus to scripture, I'm comparing it to Revelation, which we did in our Exodus 1 through 14 extensive study. If you're not familiar, I strongly suggest going to look into it. Jeff and I went into more depth into those 7 videos that I've seen in any other teaching. There are great other sound teachings, but we compiled notes from all the best ones we could find and then gave our counterpoints to where we disagreed. So in my humble opinion, and I'm not saying that as a pun or sarcastically, I do believe that it is the best, most in-depth, intense study that I'm aware of concerning Exodus 1 through 14. But anyhow, look at Exodus 12 compared to Genesis 12. Okay, so we go over to Exodus 12, right? And as they're leaving Egypt, right? Like, go to verse 32 here. And Pharaoh's saying, all right, we have the king of Egypt in Genesis 12 saying, why did you tell me she's your sister, not your wife? Take her and go. And remember how I said, there's urgency here. Look at verse 31 and 32. He calls for Moshe and Aharon and says, rise up, get you forth from among my people. Leave. Go leave. and take your flocks and your herds with me. Now compare that to Genesis 12, right? Where the Pharaoh of Egypt at this time is saying, therefore, behold your wife, take her and go. And take all your stuff with you and go. And he took everything that he had and leave. Okay, now we go further on down. Okay, and the Egyptians were urgent upon the people, that this is Exodus 12, verse 33, that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we be all dead, right? This is after the death of the firstborn, the last plague. And so there's a lot of urgency and emotion involved here, and thus the haste, right? Just get out of here before we all die. We're done with it. And the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moshe, and they borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. And Yahovah gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent unto them such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians. This is something I like to mention when we do Pesach and unleavened bread, specifically Pesach. This is one of the Pesach. This is one of the few times of the year that my wife and I will buy gifts for the children. And we will say, okay, let's see what we plundered from Egypt. Let's see what we plundered from the world to give to you, right? This is what we say when we give them their presents, because we don't really do birthdays, and we don't do Xmas and Ishtar and all the common holidays where gift giving is common. So this is one of the few times in the year that we do it in our household. So let's look at Exodus or Genesis 12 now, right? In Exodus 12, they took from the Egyptians silver and gold and clothing, right? And in Genesis 12, we see the dowry in verse 16. And then in verse 20, it says that he left with everything they had. Now look at Genesis 13 now. Okay, very next verse, first verse in Genesis 13. And Avram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south, okay? And Avram was very rich in cattle, silver, and gold. We have a mention of silver and gold. Yeah, I thought you might get a kick out of that. That's literally what I tell my children. We gave them Nerf guns this year, and dinosaur Nerf guns. And I can't remember what else we got them. We got them, my daughter a couple hair bow things, and I can't remember what all else. I wasn't really part of picking out the gifts this year. I was kind of busy doing other stuff. But we like to say, look what we plundered from Egypt as we give them the gifts. Maybe something you guys can do next year in your household if you have little ones, something to consider. But this is the main point I want to get across tonight with this. That I just visit the world and yes, do some of my shopping there for sure. Yeah, leaving Egypt comes with blessing. And we see this time and time again in Scripture. I don't have the time tonight. Well, I suppose I do, but I don't have the desire or the urgency to do this. But look at this. In verse 2 of 13, Avram was very rich in cattle, which is what we see in the dowry there, but it also says silver and gold. Is this a nod, a foreshadowing of Exodus 12? Coming up out of Egypt, very wealthy in cattle, silver, and gold. What do we see in Exodus 12 moving forward? Right? If you look at past when it talks about their silver and gold in their clothing, later on, look at verse 36 is where it says they spoiled the Egyptians. Then you go to verse 38, mixed multitude went with them, flocks, herds, and very much cattle. So in Exodus 12, we see them leaving with lots of clothing, but lots of silver, gold, and cattle. We go over to Genesis 12 and 13. What do we see Avram leaving Egypt with? Lots of cattle, silver, and gold. Coincidence? I think not. I think this was foreshadowing. I would even argue that Avram and Lot separating here in Genesis 13 is also a nod and foreshadowing, that we can see a cycle, a pattern. And again, we can apply that to the very physical leaving of Egypt in Exodus. And we can point it out a few times in the history of Israel. Coming up out of the ways of the world, out of Babylon, Egypt, what have you, whatever metaphorical term is being used to represent the ways of the world and the pagans around them, coming up out of it, very wealthy and blessed, and then a separation. There is a separation of the multitudes of the Israelites in the wilderness. You can see this in multiple examples, right? You can point out the Midianites. You can point out the fact that all but Joshua and Caleb died in the wilderness if they came up out of Mitzrayim, right? It was only those that were born, and it said what, 20 and under. So that's not even just born in the wilderness. That's born halfway through the time in the wilderness. Avram was very rich in cattle and silver and gold. Man, I was busting up about that this week. And so he went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, right? Moving back up onto the place where his tent had been at the beginning. Went right back to where he was before. Okay. So was Egypt a backsliding? I don't know. Perhaps. Or perhaps he was sent there just to receive all those, to receive that dowry. Perhaps it's both. Between Bethel and Hai, right? And of course, if you look at the names Bethel there, and then there's this whole thing about Bethel, El Bethel, and the whole, Bet El, the three different ways of saying Bethel, and why is it mentioned so many times in certain verses. But at the end of the day, Bet, right? It's Bethel. There's no H really. It's Bet El. It's house of God. Bet being house, El being God, house of God, right? And then Hai is I think that's often connected to the word I, right? So between the I and the house of God. Yeah, Ai, Ayath. AI, right, which you can connect to I, especially when looking at the Hebrew there. Onto the place of the altar, which he had made there at the first. And there Avram called on the name of Yahovah again. And Lot also, right, you like that afterthought in the writing there. And Lot also, which went with Avram, had flocks and herds and tents. So he was also had accumulated a lot from Haran. I don't know about Egypt for Lot, but I'm going to suggest perhaps, and I'm going to get into that a little bit here tonight, and then we'll probably get off here soon. I want to keep tonight a little bit short. And the land was not able to bear them, right? That they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. There was a strife between the herdsmen of Avram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. So it's giving you a little bit of timing clues. It's also giving you a clue in the sense of the environment in terms of economically and the surroundings and things like that. But at the end of the day, the issue here is between the herdsmen of Avram and Lot. It's not actually an issue between Avram and his nephew Lot, but rather their hirelings, the ones who take care of their great abundance of cattle because their substance was so great. And Avram said to Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and you, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we're brethren, we're family. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself, I pray you, from me. If you will take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you depart to the right hand, then I'll go to the left. Avram's being humble here and giving him the opportunity, saying, look, I'm seeing this issue. Separate yourself, whichever way you want to go. I'm going to let you choose, and I'm going to choose whichever direction you choose not. That way we no longer have these issues, because he sees that it's going to end up in worse issues. And it's funny because, as we talked about in the first Avram video, we see that Avram seemed to be hesitant in his walk with Yah and fully completing all that he was instructed to do. And like as often we can relate in our walks with the Father, instead of the Father condemning the individual for not having been wholeheartedly from day one, but rather stripping away bits and pieces. And perhaps there's reasons for that as well, right? So you see, he came out of his father's land in Ur, and we argued in the last video that was the main obedience that brought upon the blessings that was brought in, not the Abrahamic covenant. Two different things, okay? But then you see that he was supposed to leave his father, who then died, right? And then you see that he was supposed to leave Lot. Well, now you have a separation of Lot. So Yah's hand is over the matter, and he is now doing through Avram the instructions that he gave Avram, that Avram did not do all at once on his own, right? Again, something we can relate to in our walk. So Lot lifts up his eyes and beholds the plain of Jordan. For those of you who listened to the John the Baptist, the Johnny B video that Dirt and I did, I know I spoke really fast and I went over a lot of content in there, but there were some things that I was hinting at that I didn't go into great depths about plain of Jordan and position of John the Baptist, and why I personally, unlike Jeremiah Dirt, do not connect him to the Essenes, and how I don't connect the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, to these scenes anymore. And there's so many things to that. I'm not going to get into that tonight, but plain of Jordan. Okay, so this is not just the river Jordan. This is the plain of Jordan. This is a great region. Okay, that it was well watered everywhere before Yahavah, destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. This is before, okay? So he looks upon all the land and he says that it's well watered, right? Good for planting, good for his cattle. He's thinking, what he can do with this land. Now look at verse 10 here. Even as the garden of Yahovah, so it's saying it's plenteous and it's abundance, it has variety, lots of fruit, I'm assuming, lots of vegetation. It's teeming with wildlife and all kinds of probably great soil quality, and you can tell that by the fertile nature of the land, right? He's looking at all these things and going, well, I want that land. I want to go east, plains of Jordan, right? Now, it compares it to the Garden of Yahovah. This is a call back to Genesis 3 in the creation when you have the Garden of God, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of God, which was in Eden, right? People call it the Garden of Eden, but it's actually considered the Garden of God. And here we see that being specifically stated here, Garden of Yahovah, but this is not the only place that it says that. And look what it says after that. Like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Okay, now Zoar, keep that in mind for when we get into the Days of Lot videos. Because Zoar is the city that Lot actually asks to go to instead of the mountains, even though he ends up going to the mountains anyways. So there's some interesting connections into that, and we're not going to get into that tonight. So maybe just a little star asterisk, a little highlighting, a little underlined, whatever it is you do. But look here, for tonight's video, it's comparing it not just to the Garden of God in Eden, but it's also comparing it to the land of Egypt, where you would flee to because of a famine, right? But on top of that, okay, where did Lot get his wife? Was it from Egypt? Now, I'm not saying this is for sure, but we see Lot married down the road. Now, it's not mentioned here, so one could speculate that it's later, but I'm starting to think that there's a good possibility that Lot found his wife in Egypt while they were there, brought her out of there, and thought to himself, and this wouldn't be the main reason, but thought to himself, looking at the plains of Jordan, going, well, perhaps being forced out of her homeland, it'll be a happy home, happy wife, happy home, happy wife, happy life, if it's reminiscent. Now keep that in mind, again, when we go into the Days of Lot, because while Sodom and Gomorrah are being destroyed, it says Lot's wife looks back. And as she would have looked back, it would not have been just Sodom and Gomorrah that would have been in her purview. In her perspective, she wouldn't have just seen just Sodom and Gomorrah, but rather the plains of Jordan. Now, if it's reminiscent of Egypt, and if she came from Egypt, then perhaps looking back at Sodom and Gomorrah was not just about their life they had in Sodom and Gomorrah, but rather looking back all the way to Egypt. This is wishing she had never come out of Egypt, physically as well as spiritually. Yeah, we don't see Lot being considered married until after this. But the more I'm looking at Genesis 19 and 13, I'm starting to think she came up out of Egypt. Interestingly enough, in Genesis 12, it says that part of that dowry is what I'm calling the dowry in verse, 15 or 16? I think it was 15, right? Go down, 12, 16. It says sheep, oxen, donkeys, men servants, and maidservants. Sarai's maidservant, Hagar, was an Egyptian. Seems like some of that substance, some of that great abundance that came up out of Mitzrayim with Avram's household actually caused problems down the road. And as Avram and his household and his descendants were being directed by Yah to spiritually come up out of Mitzrayim, out of the ways of the world, that which was of Mitzrayim would be dropped and left behind. Unnecessary burdens and weights. I know it's not a nice thing to say about Lot's wife, is it? Something to think about. Okay, so let's finish up chapter 13 here. Okay. So Lot looks to the plains of Jordan and he journeys east to the plains of Jordan. He looks between the plains of Jordan. You remember how I mentioned in the last Avram video that perhaps part of Haran and the reason of why wanting to leave and coming through Canaan, remember the argument and the understanding of if Haran was in Turkey, it seems that the location that it most likely would have been on would have been the edge of where things look fertile and would have started looking more like wilderness desert. So that would be, and that's why I argued in the last video that Terah, Avram's dad, would want to stop there, right? And name it after his deceased son. And then we see as Avram continues south, he goes into Canaan. There's a famine there, so he moves all the way down to Mitzrayim, which is going great. But then there's problems, and they get kicked out. So he comes all the way back, right? And he stops in Bethel. And so we see Lot looking to the plains of Jordan, which would leave Avram the more desolate lands, right? He picked the best for himself. And so he journeys east, and they separate themselves from one from another. Verse 12 here, Avram dwelled in the land of Canaan, where there was famine, so there's probably some issues there at the very least. Even if it's starting to kick back up, it's not going to right away, right? So he dwells in Canaan, and Lot dwells in the cities of the plain and pitches his tent towards Sodom, so out of the land that he took for himself. It seems to me when it says pitched his tent, it's not just about the facing the direction of the door towards, as in his mind is looking towards, but also actually located in the region that he would have taken as the land for himself. He would have picked the edge of that part closest to, showing that in his mind and in his heart, he was already looking forward towards Sodom, which is something that Jeff mentioned. Yeah, I know. Like I said, 12:5. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, there is no mention of wife in chapter 12 or 13. I'm just saying perhaps that's when he brought her out, and then maybe they weren't married yet. I could be wrong; it's just speculation. But as it seems to me, it fits very nicely as to why you would have a nod here in 13 verse 10 to it looking like Egypt, as well as 19 of Lot's wife looking back. That's all I'm saying. But yes, I do acknowledge, as I did earlier, that Genesis doesn't actually claim that Lot has a wife at this point yet. So we can't say for sure. Just seems to me there's a good chance. Okay, so his tent is towards Sodom. His doorway is probably directed that way, right? As you see, like with Daniel and others, even the direction of your door, where you look towards, where your window would be towards, where you would pray towards, shows where your heart and mind was directed. But the region of the land that Lot would have taken in the plains of Jordan would have been facing towards, and it says the cities of the plain. So he's trying to get as close as he can in the direction of Sodom. And remember, it said Zoar in verse 10 there, right? So that's not too far off from Sodom and Gomorrah. And then it goes on to say, but the men of Sodom were wicked and the sinners before Yahovah exceedingly. Okay, this was the Las Vegas and LA and New York City and Chicago and Hong Kong of the world at that time, it seems. And Yahovah said to Avram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thy eyes. Okay, now he's out of Ur. He's separated from his dad, who's now dead, and he's separated from Lot. And he's gone into the land that he was directed. We can now finally say, Genesis 13, verse 14, Avram has fully done all that he was instructed back before he left Ur, according to the speech of Stephen in Acts chapter 7 that we talk about in the last video going over the bottom of Genesis 11. So all this time, right? And I'm suggesting up to possibly 40 years on Haran, right? And that's not even counting the travels from Ur to Haran, Haran to Bethel, Bethel down to Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim back to Bethel, right? So we're finally at that point now. Now that Lot was separated from him, look at the wording here. Yahovah said to Avram, after that Lot was separated from him, he waited for that final last thing. Now he says to him, lift up now thine eyes. Look up from the place where thou art, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. Look all around you. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Then Avram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, right? And yes, you can connect Hebron, as a lot of pastors would say it's Hebron. You can actually connect that to Chevron, interestingly enough, and built there an altar unto Yahovah. So that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. We're not going to move forward from this until I feel led to do the Avram. So there's a good chance I'll go back to the 1 Samuel study before coming back to this one. Might be a bounce back and forth. I don't know yet. But we will leave it on this note that the seed here in verse 15, 16, we're also talking, there is physical seed and there's spiritual seed. Just like there is physical Israel and there's spiritual Israel. Right? And there are agreements and covenants for the physical, with the Abrahamic covenant, and then there's also spiritual. So these are all things that we will discuss in much more depth down the road, and we will talk about the Pharisees, and Yeshua saying not that you have Avram as a father. If you had Abraham as a father, then you would love me and you would listen to me and you would do as the Father says, and yet you do not. Therefore, you do not have the love of the Father in you. And then, Yeshua said that Avram saw his day and rejoiced it. And that's a whole nother thing. Yah willing, we'll get into that on how in Genesis, was it 20:21, it says that Avraham, it's Abraham at this point, had looked ahead before bringing Isaac up, possibly with Ishmael, according to Jesher, which scripture does say that he had 2 other young men with him. So either a manservant and another manservant, or maybe a manservant and Ishmael, which would be very interesting. But we'll leave that for another video. But perhaps when Avram looked ahead to where he was going, he saw spiritually of what it was to signify. I have reasons I'm saying that. That is more on point than it is speculative, but we will leave that for another video. Can Lot and Avram dividing be a foreshadow of the division of Israel into the northern and southern kingdom? Oh. I would have to think on that. My first instinctual response is I find that interesting, but my first intuitive response, which can be wrong, my first knee-jerk reaction to that is no, simply in that both were very disobedient, and that you have the death of the Messiah, bringing in and establishing that covenant, allowing that northern kingdom, the 10 lost tribes, to come back in. So my knee jerk would be no, but that's something to think about. Maybe I'll make a note of that. And perhaps my answer will change if I look more into it and pray on it. Let me write it down real quick. Avram, Lot. Avram would represent the southern, I'm assuming then, and Lot the north. Even though we have a east and west movement rather than a south and north, it would be nicer if it was south and north. Not that it has to be, but I'm just saying. Yeah, definitely not a perfect comparison. I'll consider it and look into it. I'll see, because I get what you're getting at a little bit, Karen, but I think perhaps we could argue more like Israel and Midian and things of that nature rather than northern and southern. That's something I'm more apt to compare. Or Jacob parting with Laban and dividing the animals. That might be something more too. Let's see. Yaakov and Laban. Yeah, you do see him leaving with a lot. Do you see the physical spiritual seed in the sand versus stars mentioned? We'll go into that later. We'll go into that in the next video, because that's opening up a whole nother thing, and I would need probably another hour and a half, 2 hours to really go into all the Abrahamic, the covenant and the promises and the multiple things and what it means to be the physical heir and the spiritual heir, because there are blessings for both of those things. And this is why we see the physical descendants of Avraham being blessed in certain things, because it was non-conditional, as I mentioned before in the beginning of chapter 12 here. But when you talk about the stars and the sand, I am more apt to lean towards it being spiritual. I'll leave it at that for now. And there's all kinds of things that I'll tie into that. But short answer, spiritual over physical on that nature. And when it talks about inheriting the land, it's actually more so fulfilled in a future tense that we have yet to see with millennial reign and thereafter with new heaven and new earth, rather than prior to, even though you do see a partial for the physical, if you will. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else in my notes. This is last chance for questions and concerns and thoughts. See if there was anything in here. One of my notes is Christopher Eames suggests that the Teru of Urkesh that is found in the Mari letters is the same person as Terah of Ur in the Bible. And if that's the case, again, that points to Turkey for both Ur and Haran. I'm not going to go into all of that tonight with the Christopher Eames. I might go back into that and the Mari letters and stuff like that, and the trip into Shechem and the different views, because there's like 3 or 4 different paths, but there's really one that most agree on, and I'm actually not in agreement with it. I'm starting to lean more and more towards the straight line from Turkey straight down. Ur being the northern, not the southern Ur of the empire, coming down to Haran and then coming down to Canaan. And it's a straight line rather than going all the way up and then down, instead of, you could have easily gone across if it was a Sumerian southern portion of the Ur empire. But again, perhaps that'll be another video. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns? Let me see. Compared famine with Joseph. Compared verse 15 and 16 to Esther. Compared Exodus 12 with Genesis 12. Oh, see, I had it outlined here even better. I should have just looked at my notes. I have the actual verses with certain things, very much cattle in Exodus 12, verse 38 there, and certain things italicized and emboldened. Okay. Plains of Jordan being the large area well watered compared to S&G, but also Egypt. Zoar is the smaller city of Lot. We talked about that a little bit. Is it perhaps possible Lot got his wife from Egypt? Discuss that theory. Plains of Jordan represented Egypt. Okay. Yeah, so the only thing I didn't mention is the metaphor, which we kind of already talked about, the metaphor for the world. The ways of the world, the love of the world. This is not the only place that we see Egypt representing that, right? This is why, and most of you understand that in the chat, but for anybody who's new to it or isn't familiar with this understanding, this is not the only place that I'm going to argue that this represents a spiritual as well as physical coming up out of Egypt. We see this all over the place. And if you're curious, especially if it's new to you, I'm going to give you a few seconds to get a piece of paper and a pencil, or you can rewind and pause and come back and maybe even slow it down if I go too fast. But I'm going to give you a list of verses to consider this, understanding this picture all throughout Scripture that we see a very physical place representing a spiritual bondage to the world, right? So the biggest main ones are Babylon and Egypt, okay? That's why you see in Revelations like 11 or Revelations verses 17, verse 5, Revelation 16, 19, Revelations 14, 8. You see references to this come up out of Babylon, right? It's not talking physical Babylon of this mystery Babylon. It's talking about a spiritual Babylon. Perhaps there's physical indications as well. A lot of people like to point to Europe or America or this, that, and the other. But it seems to me mystery Babylon would be more like along the lines of the entire one world, new world order religion coming together in a unified fashion as the Antichrist takes place on stage. Thus, a greater Babylon, a version of the kingdoms used in the past, much like Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and Egypt. And you could even argue Nineveh under the rule of Nimrod, when he had the plains of Shinar with the Tower of Babel. You could even argue Sodom and Gomorrah. Even Sodom and Nineveh are used for examples in certain verses, but mostly it's Babylon or Egypt. Okay, so like 11 verse 8, Revelations 11 verse 8, you see the dead bodies, talking about the 2 witnesses. I already discussed back in the Johnny B video as to why I believe that's a physical and not a spiritual. It's not. I'm not personally convinced of it representing the 2 sticks of the house, Joseph and Ephraim, as you see in Ezekiel 37, and this argument of them being the 2 candlesticks. And then, some even argue that the menorah becomes from 7 to 2. They look at the churches in Revelation and how 5 of the 7 were threatened to have the candlestick taken out of their place, and they use Zechariah, but then in Zechariah it says the menorah still has 7 branches. But we talk about all that in Johnny B video. But in Revelations 11 verse 8 here, you have the dead bodies shall lie, talking about the 2 witnesses in the street of the great city, right? Very physical indicators, as it seems to me, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord, talking about Yeshua, was crucified. So that's just one example of referencing Jerusalem, as Sodom and Egypt spiritually, right? So this whole Babylon, Egypt, Sodom, and Nineveh as metaphors, it's all throughout Scripture. So I'm going to give you some scriptures to consider if this is a brand new study for you. Hopefully in this time you've had enough time to get a pen and paper. Okay, Isaiah chapter 1. Keep in mind, during the time of that writing of Isaiah 1, Sodom and Gomorrah would have been gone by that time. Okay, that's something to think about. Isaiah chapter 3, Isaiah chapter 13, Jeremiah chapter 23, Lamentations chapter 4, Ezekiel chapter 16, which is a really good one, Genesis chapter 18, specifically verses 20 to 21, Deuteronomy chapter 29, Luke chapter 17, Revelations 11:8, which we already went over a couple seconds ago, Revelations 14 verse 8, Revelations 16 verse 19, Revelations 17 verse 5, Matthew chapter 10 verse 15, 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 6, and one could even tie in Nineveh as a metaphor when you consider verses like Matthew 12:41, but that's not as strong of a case as some of those other verses when you're looking at the whole Babylon, Egypt understanding of it representing the ways of the world. Yes, I know, Karen, too fast. Okay, one more time slow for those who are taking notes. Okay, Isaiah chapter 1, Isaiah chapter 3, Isaiah chapter 13, Jeremiah chapter 23, Lamentations chapter 4, Ezekiel chapter 16, Genesis 18, verses 20 to 21, Deuteronomy chapter 29, Luke chapter 17, Revelations chapter 11, verse 8, Revelations chapter 14, verse 8, Revelations chapter 16, verse 19, Revelations chapter 17, verse 5. Matthew chapter 10, verse 15. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6. And a less solid example of showing spiritual examples of places as a metaphor, spiritually as a metaphor, physical, very real physical places as a spiritual metaphor. Matthew chapter 12, verse 41. Hopefully that was slow enough. If not, you guys are going to have to go back because I'm not going to. We'll have to study out leaving having plundered. Yeah, Karen, if you do that, send me the notes on that because I think I have notes on it somewhere haphazardly all throughout the place in my notebooks, but I have something like 20 notebooks from the past 10 years, and I'm not organized like you are. Okay. I had all but 3, I'm sure. Yeah, and and Karen, I this was the short list of what I thought was solid. I had to stop myself. I kept hearing the Spirit too much because I had so many verses to suggest. I mean, this, for those of you who want to do this study, don't think that those are all the verses that you can tie in with this topic. And some of those verses are just trying to tie in the context understanding. Some of those ones I gave you, like in Isaiah and stuff like that, it's talking about how bad Israel is, and then I'm showing you how bad Sodom and Gomorrah is, so that when you see in Isaiah chapter 1 the comparison, that it's not just a flippant comparison. So some of those examples I gave you are to give you a better context of the wickedness and why those comparisons are being made. And I think that when we see those things, especially when it's new, it helps us understand more so how there is a lot of mercy and grace in Yah's decision and his very just but very merciful and compassionate and graceful decisions on how he punishes his own people. Because as always, he had the very right to just scorch the earth, 10,000 times over, or whatever it is you think would be the worst punishment. He had every just right to do that when he did not. So, but there are many more other verses. I don't even want to speculate because I want to say 40, 50 more verses I didn't add into that study. And there was still lots more that I wanted to go through that I wanted to suggest. So there's a lot to it. Is this the regular time and day for your live streams? So lately I've been doing Wednesdays and Saturdays in the evening, typically around the time of when I started tonight. So for Eastern Standard Time, somewhere between 7 and 7:30 at night. Sometimes as late as 8, but I try not to go too much later than that. And I base that timing off of trying to get my children to go to sleep. So sometimes I'm a little bit late in videos. Sometimes they start a little bit later than I would like. And sometimes that's because, maybe I'll let the children watch a movie longer than I should have, or I wanted to play with them longer, or they're struggling with falling asleep, whatever the case may be. Usually it has to do with the factor of the children. So as unprofessional as that is, there is no strict scheduled time. And as for the Wednesdays, I've been doing that because I have time to do more full-time ministries right now in this season. I feel like I'm being called to do full-time ministry, which makes me feel like if I'm not doing at least 2 videos a week on average, that I'm not really ponying up to that urgency and calling to do this more full-time. So I'm trying to do this 2 to 3 times a week. It's been more so twice a week. But when Sit Rep comes back, I'm assuming they're coming back. I know Aaron right now, Samson's been busy. He's got a new child and he has a promotion with his job. So I'm not sure how long before he'll come back. But when he decides to come back, when he feels like he has the time and things of that nature, I don't know if I'll still be doing Wednesday nights because I've been doing it pretty much in their time slot. So perhaps I'll go beforehand on Wednesday nights, or perhaps I'll move to a different day. But for the foreseeable future, Saturday nights and Wednesday nights, and then past that, at least 2 to 3 times a week is the plan currently, subject to change. Yeah, Karen, Yah is providing in ways that I have not been mentioning in the videos, and I don't like mentioning personal things like that. But Yah has been providing more than I need, and it has been coming with a little bit of faith. It does call for my household to trust in that provision, because it's not always as concrete. It's not a steady, this will come in and then this will be paid off kind of thing. But he has provided more than need be. So he has been providing. It's me that's not been fulfilling on the calling. It's not been an issue of provision. It's been rather an issue of me doing videos when I don't feel like doing it. Me doing videos, going on to live recordings, feeling like I might sound like a bumbling ignoramus. I don't like coming on here unless I feel like I have enough notated to really thoroughly put forward a case. And I feel like if I'm just going to be rambling, that it's not worth it. Not so much for me, but rather for the listener. So sometimes that's the struggle. I don't feel like coming on here because I feel like I'm not as ready as I'd like to be, or I'm not in the right mind space. If I feel like I'm in a down and out mind space, or not feeling it, or if I'm not physically feeling it. Like today, I didn't think I was going to do the video today because I had like this sick, nauseating migraine thing going on, and I felt miserable. And then my son prayed for me. And then my wife gave me some natural herbal remedy tincture thing of oil of oregano and water. You have to dilute it so that it doesn't burn your throat, and manuka honey and all this other stuff. But anyways, Yah has been providing. And right now I'm just in one of those fork of the road moments where I keep hearing, I'm calling you to do this full time, but if you're going to do it, you need to pony up more and do this more full time. Otherwise, compromise, cop out, and do this part-time and do something else part-time. But I keep getting the feeling that if I do that I won't be doing as I'm called, and not that it's about the blessings, but the blessings probably would decrease at that point. But so right now it's a matter of faith and trust in discerning that is the true calling. But okay, seems like there aren't any more questions or concerns or comments for tonight's video, so I'm gonna head off. We're at about an hour and a half for tonight, which is what I wanted. About an hour and a half. Short videos, which is nice for this Avram study, because Avram is not my it's not my forte. This is not like Genesis 4 or some other topics like Jonas, the book of Jonah, or the book of Esther, where I feel like I can give really well done, seminars for days and for hours, or Exodus 1 through 14. This is not my strong suit. So I like doing these shorter videos. It gives me a chance to really study up and go through all the different accounts and things. Yeah, it's good seeing you too, Monica Moore. Hey, So during those Exodus 1 through 14 studies, I said that we probably wouldn't do mugs, and now we have mugs. Although actually this isn't one of our mugs, so I shouldn't have showed that while I said that. This is actually the mugs that we had made to give away. This is one that I kept for myself to give away. But we have D&G mugs. For those who are interested, if you look up Nana Z's on Instagram, we have D&G 144 stuff. We have the old shirts. We have the one and only place you can get the Take on the World TV t-shirt to show your support of Take on the World TV. We have Way Remnant merchandise, hats and shirts and mugs and color changing mugs and floral mugs and all kinds of stuff. So if you haven't checked it out, Nana Z's Marketplace at Instagram, if you just put in Nana Z's, it should pop up. It looks like a little sukkah, like for Sukkot, a little sukkah. And we got all kinds of stuff on there, and there's more stuff coming in. Yeah, okay, you got a mug. Well, I hope you enjoy it. Here I'm telling you about the mug, and you already know. Oh, you probably got the giveaway one, though, right? We have new ones. And they're customizable. You can change the color and stuff like that. And we have color changing ones where you pour hot tea or hot coffee in it, and it shows. And then when it's cold, it goes back to black. So, but anyways, okay. I'm glad you enjoyed KMC. As always, I don't just pray and hope. I trust that Yah has used this video to bless the listener in some manner. I'm to the point where I trust that he does that with every video, because he has shown me so much so that is the case. So may Yah bless you and keep you according to his will, if you are so, in fact, in alignment with him. And if not, that he calls you to him. And if you have stopped walking, if you have sat down, or if you have, Yah forbid, turned around and walked back, that you heed that call of repentance, that you turn around, that you stand up, that you start walking forward in alignment with him, that you draw nigh to him, because scripture says that if you draw nigh to him, he will also draw nigh to you, and you can have that alignment, that relationship. The one who declares the end from the beginning, who declares Exodus from Avram, but so much more than that, right? But for tonight's thing. Yeah, I saw that. My wife said that was part of the order. So it's not my business, so I don't always get to be privy to all the details, because I don't make things and I don't do things. I just get sponsored by the merchandise. So, but yeah, my wife does. She does the mugs, and anyhow, I hope they enjoyed it. The color changing mugs, they're pretty cool. All right, may Yah bless you and keep you according to his will. May he use his word as a lamp upon your feet, and directing you and guiding you in your walk with him and to him, towards that everlasting hope, not turning to the left or to the right. May he put it in you to heed the guidance of the Holy Spirit upon your walk. May he look upon you with his face, with his panesh, with countenance, with favor. And may he grant you his shalom. Good night. Thank you for listening in to D&G 144. This is Draw Nigh to the Creator Show here at Take on the World TV. We hope to see you next time.
Yeah. He's alive. It's really just that simple, man. Draw nigh to God, man. Yeah. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you.